European lawmakers still disagree about who is responsible for the hundreds of thousands of migrants flooding into Europe. But in the last 20 minutes, Austria's chancellor has announced its country will grant unhindered passage to migrants traveling at least from Hungary.
This after the British Prime Minister today announced the UK will accept thousands more Syrian refugees. He added that a comprehensive strategy is needed, not just a plan to relocate migrants.
More than 11 million people have been driven from their homes. Now, Britain has a moral responsibility to help these refugees, as we've done throughout our history.
The announcement came as hundreds of migrants are actually walking through Macedonia to get to neighboring Greece to board a train there through to Western Europe. The British Prime Minister says he will meet with non-governmental agencies to figure out a plan here. The British government is adding £100 million in financial aid, so that's about $152 million.
Yeah, and international estimates are that 364,000 migrants have arrived in Europe and 2,800 have died trying. The vast majority come by sea. Most refugees have arrived in Greece and Italy.
And in Hungary, one death has been confirmed as some 500 migrants remain there at a train station. The train has been sitting in that station now for at least 2 days. Many of the migrants refuse to go to a processing center nearby, and police are refusing to let the train through to Austria. But again, we just heard from the Austrian chancellor, trains will not be accepted in. It's not known exactly how this 50-year-old man, how he died.
And take a look at these pictures here. This is in Hungary, where refugees broke out of a camp there. Children being passed over the fence, and older children and adults climbed over. Riot police tried to hold the crowds back. About a dozen did escape, but were stopped by authorities along a nearby highway.
And these images, they are tough to see as European leaders, they're grappling with solutions to the humanitarian crisis. Some here in the U.S. say the warning signs that a problem of this magnitude would happen, they were there, but they were missed.
And today in the 4x4, we are taking 4 minutes during the 4 o'clock hour here to look at one of the root causes of the Syrian refugee crisis and what American leaders can learn about our own security.
We'd like to bring in now Francesco Femia, the co-founder and director of the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, D.C. Francesco, thanks for being here. Those images, they're heartbreaking. They're hard to see. People are dying, children are dying, and by all accounts, you read the paper, you watch the news, it's because of war there in Syria. They're trying to find safety, but you see another connection. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to recognize that obviously, you know, the scale of migration that's happening and the scale of the refugee crisis has been primarily caused by the civil war that's happening in Syria. So that's the main cause of what's happening right now. But what happened from 2007 to 2010 in Syria contributed to the unrest that ultimately led to the country plunging into civil war, and that was a major drought. So Syria experienced one of the worst droughts in its recorded history during that time period. And that drought, in addition to natural resource mismanagement by the Assad regime, basically the regime was subsidizing water-intensive cotton and wheat, which really depleted the water table. That displaced about 2 million Syrians from the period 2008 to 2010, and those people basically had to move or starve. And so that migration that was internal to Syria may have contributed to the instability that ultimately led to the conflict in Syria. And of course, since then, the country has been plunged into a horrific civil war, and people are fleeing to find a safe haven, and the closest safe haven in the region are some of the Arab countries around Syria, but also Europe.
But Francesco, it's got to be the kidnappings, the mortar attacks, the chemical weapons that really have been used on citizens there even before 2013, according to the UN. I mean, that is the primary reason millions of people are on the move. You know, I mean, you say the drought contributed, but is there actual scientific evidence that you have that says it in fact contribute to this?
Yeah, I mean, it clearly we would say in academic terms, the the proximate cause of this refugee crisis is the war, are things like being attacked by chemical weapons, ISIS attacks on communities, etc. Those are the reasons that people are moving right now. But there is scientific evidence that a climate exacerbated drought during that period, 2007, 2011, contributed to the displacement of about 2 million people before the conflict broke out. So we have to make sure we separate those two things. So that was social unrest happening before the conflict, and since the conflict, the magnitude of the refugee crisis and the internally displaced people's crisis has skyrocketed. So yeah, I think no responsible person would say that climate change is causing or directly causing this particular crisis we're seeing right now, but it contributed to those conditions before the country fell into civil war that basically made people's lives worse. And that's what we're talking about. So I think it's very important to make that distinction, because otherwise, regimes in the area, including the Assad regime, terrorist organizations like ISIS, can point the finger at climate change and say, oh, it's not our fault, it's climate change.
Francesco, let me jump in here. What do we do now? Okay, we have millions of people leaving Syria. How do we move forward when it comes to security? What can we learn from all of this?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of environmental stress, I mean, there are a lot of things that are difficult to manage, and that's, the political and economic situation in the region. And there's a lot that needs to be done there. But we actually, in some ways, know a bit more about what the region's going to look like in the future in terms of its climate, in terms of climate projections, and also in terms of its water resources. And so what we can do is encourage governments in the region to basically do things that are going to conserve water. For example, instead of using what the Assad regime was encouraging, flood irrigation, which wastes about 60% of the water that's used in agriculture, you could move to drip irrigation. That's just one kind of practical program that's doable that can basically save water and prevent those kinds of water resource crises happening.
Okay, so Francesco, if we have that in place and we don't have a drought, do we still have a civil war?
That's really, I can't say. I mean, it's hard to know. Climate change and drought and environmental stress is one factor that exacerbates other drivers of conflict, and so it's really impossible to say. But what we can say with certainty, and the academic literature backs us up on this, is that climate change and droughts in the region can certainly place additional strains on peoples that can make the likelihood of conflict greater. So,
Francesco, sorry, we got to jump in. Interesting conversation here. We're out of time. Francesco Femia, co-founder and director of the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you, Francesco.
Thanks for having me.